Gary Anderson.
Of soccer-style kicking, and I'm a soccer-style kicker where you kick the ball with the side of your foot, has more recently started to dominate in football. I loved the game of cricket growing up. You know, really the three main games in the country of South Africa where I grew up are rugby, cricket, and soccer, and really in that order. And I loved them all as a kid growing up in their season. And I heard really the only kicker who's in the NFL Hall of Fame. His name is Jan Stenerud, and Jan was a Norwegian, and I heard him describe that question that we get asked so often as field goal kickers is, you know, how do you concentrate when there's 1 second left and you got to go out there on the field and kick that ball between the goalposts, and what you do is going to determine the outcome of the game on that given Sunday. And Jan explained it. He was a downhill ski racer, and he talked about how when you grow up as a downhill ski racer and you're going down that mountain close to 100 miles an hour, you learn at a real young age how to focus on every little bump and crevice and groove on that ski slope, because if you don't, you may die. You know? Now, mine wasn't quite that dramatic, but in the game of cricket, for people who don't understand it, it can be a long, drawn-out game. A high school game takes all day. An international game of cricket can actually last 5 days, which most people find to be quite amazing. Yeah. But I was often the opening batsman in cricket. And one of the things that I just detested as a young boy growing up in South Africa was to make a mental mistake and do something dumb out there which caused you to be out, you know, and then you have to sit and watch sometimes for hours before you get a chance to go on the field again. I didn't like that very much, you know, so I think really more so I attribute the game of cricket and those early skills, the whole mental skill of being able to focus and concentrate. And I learned that at a very young age because, you know, a lot of people feel what I did for 23 years in the NFL is the most pressurized job in all of sports, that 1 second win or lose the game deal that we have to do quite often. You know, it's interesting looking back on it. Of course, you're a lot wiser and so forth, but at the time, you know, my family immigrated to the States in 1978, and I was 18 years old. So I spent the first 18 years of my life growing up in Durban. And as a kid growing up...
Where is that located geographically?
Durban is on the Indian Ocean. You know, most people, if you think of South Africa, the southern tip of Africa, Cape Town is right at the bottom. Mm-hmm. Johannesburg is inland, sort of north inland, and Durban is on the Indian Ocean. You have Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, East London, Durban. Durban's actually the biggest port in all of Africa. So, you know, as a kid growing up, mostly focused on things that I was focused on, which was rugby, cricket, and soccer. You know, it didn't strike me as anything different till much later. You know, as you start to get later on in your teens, and you start to get a little bit of a perspective on the rest of the world, and you know, all those years growing up playing those sports, I never ever played against a person of color. You know, that apartheid policy which the Dutch government introduced in South Africa. You know, I lived in suburbs of Durban that were white suburbs, and blacks lived in their suburbs, and Indians lived in their areas, and even the big professional soccer stadium in Durban where I used to go and watch games. There were sections for the different races, and you know, as a kid, you just, I guess, think that's the way it is, you know, until you get a little older and you start to get a little more of a balance and better perspective on life. Say not so much in his sermons, but certainly at home over the dinner table. And in fact, my dad had talked about it for years, and my dad was Irish, so he wasn't a native South African. My mom is South African. And my dad actually used to, as a family, we didn't agree at all with the entire policies of apartheid. And I remember Dad over the dinner table over the course of several years, I think he was indirectly preparing our family for the day I remember very vividly over dinner when I was a senior in high school, when my dad talked about our family leaving and coming to America. And the reason our family decided to leave was really because of our opposition to the apartheid policies. And I know my dad, being Irish, you know, and my dad was always very much of a historian, and he could just see a lot of the issues in South Africa, whereas I think perhaps people who were born and bred South Africans didn't have that, you know, wider vision that my dad had. And, you know, he said it, and looking back on it many years later, my dad's passed away now, but my dad had incredible wisdom, because I remember that evening where he mentioned the whole idea of us immigrating to the States, and he talked about that it wasn't for him and my mom, it was for us. And I'm one of 5 kids, and our kids someday, of which I have 2 myself now. And you know, looking back on it, it was a very brave thing and a very courageous thing that my dad did, was to, you know, uproot our whole family of 5 kids, 7 of us, and come to America. No, my dad was actually a Baptist minister. Long story short, my dad ended up taking that position as the pastor of that Baptist church in that small town of Downingtown, Pennsylvania. And then somehow, I don't know what happened to me. I grew up, I never owned a sweater in my life, never ever heard of a heated home or heated car. And I ended up shortly thereafter at Syracuse, then I've been in Pittsburgh, not too many more places. Our second evening in America, we were having dinner with them. And over the course of dinner, them knowing that we were soccer players, my dad was actually a professional soccer player in Ireland before he went into the ministry in South Africa. So they started to talk about this game that we knew, soccer, and then they got around to switching gears to this game of American football, which we knew nothing at all about. And of course, they immediately, knowing of our soccer backgrounds, they started to explain that there's actually one particular position in the game of football where the guy kicks the ball. And then I'll never forget the thing that they explained that was quite strange and a very foreign concept to us, was they said this guy who's called the kicker, all he does is go out on the field and kick the ball between the goalposts, and then he comes on the sidelines and watches the rest of the game, you know. And that was a very foreign concept, because all of the games that I'd grown up playing in South Africa, the 3 main games of soccer, rugby, and cricket, you know, I was on the field the whole time. You know, we didn't even know about this concept of substitutions hardly, let alone specialists. And I'll never forget, because as we listened to this gentleman explain this particular position, my first question was, "So tell me now, what does this football look like?" And I was in my head comparing it to a rugby ball that I'd grown up kicking all my life. And the following morning, this gentleman brought over a couple of American footballs, first time I ever laid eyes on them. And that very same afternoon, I think it was our 3rd day in America, I took these 2 American footballs up to this small little high school field in this town of Downingtown. And I was just, you know, I was 18, I was interested to see if in fact they went like a rugby ball when I kicked them. So if you can imagine that scene, here's just this little kid, young kid from Africa, out on the field by myself kicking these 2 footballs. And you see, in rugby, they have goalposts just very similar to American football goalposts. I had done that all my life, kicked the rugby ball through the goalpost. And a gentleman came out onto the field and introduced himself as the high school football coach in that small town. And he later told me, he said he knew all the kids in that town, and he said he'd never seen anybody kick a ball like that. He just saw it, as he described, from a distance, these balls sailing through the air. So we started chatting. I was very fortunate. He was a good personal friend of Dick Vermeil, who was the head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles at the time, and he set it up for me the following day, which was my 4th day in America, to go and have a tryout with the Philadelphia Eagles. And they used to have their training camp in a neighboring town to Downingtown, a small town called Westchester. So here I go, my 4th day in America, to have a pro football try. I don't even know what pro football is. You know? And I show up in my shorts and T-shirt and soccer shoes, you know.
What'd you think?
That's amazing.
Did they have the big guys there when you?
Well, no, not at first. The thing that there are several things I'll never forget about that day, because it was really a very significant day in my life. That's how my football career got started. When I met Coach Vermeil, I think his friend had told me that I was just 18, and he went into this long dissertation about how at the time the NFL rules, you had to go to university for 4 years before you could even consider playing professional football. So he explained that to me, and even though I didn't know what football was, you know, I was a little disappointed because it sounded kind of exciting to me. And then I think it was just kind of near the beginning of the period where a lot of the NFL teams were starting to have kickers on their teams who had these foreign soccer backgrounds. And it was probably that fact that even though he knew I was just 18, he said, hey, we're going to take you out on the field. And between practices, you know, all NFL teams was during their training camp period where they have a morning and afternoon practice. And I vaguely remember when we went out on the field, he had a great big bag of these footballs, but there were quite a few gentlemen with him, and I now would know they would have been probably the special teams coach and several scouts, but there were about 5 or 6 of them. And I was at a big ESPN awards banquet in New York a few years ago where Dick Vermeil actually told the story himself 25 years later, and he said the thing that amazed him, he said something to me. We had this bag of about, keep in mind I'd only seen 2 of these footballs the day before for the first time, and they had about 20 of them in the bag. And he said to me, you know, why don't you take a few minutes and warm up? And from my rugby background, he told the story of how I just grabbed these footballs off the ground, one after the other, and drop kicked them through the goalpost, which he said we haven't seen in America in like 50 or 70 years or something. And he said this kid from Africa started drop kicking these things through the goalpost from 50 yards. He said my scouts and coaches, we were standing there with our mouths open, you know. So that's the part that I didn't know. I was out there kicking probably for about half an hour with Coach Vermeil. When the players started to come down this hill from the locker room, I guess, to start the afternoon practice. So now I've kind of got one eye on what I'm doing, kicking these footballs between the goalposts, and I'm seeing these guys coming down onto the practice field. And I can promise you I've never seen guys that big in all my life, you know, with these helmets and all this stuff on I'd never ever seen before. But the really fortunate thing about that day, I had not realized, but Coach Vermeil had spread the word. And of course I understand all of this years later. There's a lot of university coaches that come and watch the pro teams during that training camp period, and there were 4 university coaches that particular afternoon when I was out there, and Coach Vermeil had spread the word to them that, you know, he was taking out this young kid from Africa who was just 18, probably looking to go to university. And I remember when I finished kicking, I went over to my dad, who was over on the sidelines, and my dad introduced me to these 4 college coaches. They had all figured out who my dad was, and all 4 of them had offered me a scholarship to go to their right there on the spot. And actually the amazing thing, maybe the most amazing thing about that day, my dad later told me once these gentlemen had left, he said, you know what was absolutely incredible? He said 3 of those guys watched you for the whole time, the half hour that you were kicking, but one of them only came right near the end and saw you, and he also offered you a scholarship, and he said that these guys are claiming that, you know, to go to a major university in America could be worth, like, you know, something along the lines of maybe $100,000 if you go for 4 years. And my dad turned to me and he said, I think this game of football is a big game in America. So that was my start with this whole crazy game of American football. I ended up choosing to go to Syracuse University, and academics had always been a big part of my family, and very important part. And the other thing, I know the Syracuse football coach, we added a little addendum at the end of my football scholarship whereby he agreed to always allow me to play soccer as well. And I actually went up there with the idea I was going to play soccer and do this other crazy game I'd never seen before whenever they needed me to do it. I tell people, if I do have any claim to fame, I may be the only football player ever who the first game of football I ever saw, we played Florida State University, was the first game I ever played in was the first game I ever saw. You know, I didn't even know what a first down was in my first game, and I remember having some fairly lengthy and a little heated discussions with the head football coach. Even though we had in writing he'd allow me to play soccer, he was not too crazy about me playing soccer on a Friday night before we were playing Penn State or Pitt or somebody in football the next day. And I kept trying to convince him, you know, Coach, you know, I was 18, I was a soccer player, I could run all day. You know, I just said, don't worry, you know, I just have to kick a couple of these field goal things. I won't be tired, don't worry. You know? And it took me really a couple of years at Syracuse as I gradually started to understand and appreciate the game more, to realize that even though I was not on the field for the entire game like I had been used to growing up playing the other sports that I'd grown up with, I could have a dramatic impact on the outcome of a game, even though I may just be out there for a couple of kicks. And the head coach later told me the story how we were going out on the tunnel, out onto the field to start my first football game, and I went to the head coach and I said, and he said my lips were kind of quivering a little bit, and I said to him something to the effect of, Coach, just make sure when you think it's time for me to go out there during the game and kick, that you tell me which one of the two goalposts you need me to kick it through. You know? I didn't even know what a first down was in my first game. You know? The thing I recall about that, you know, was kind of the local kid being drafted by the Bills from Syracuse, and I was awfully excited about starting, you know, my pro career. And I think, you know, a similar thing happens to a lot of rookies at NFL training camps. It becomes a case of, you know, you're trying too hard and so forth, and, you know, you haven't really learned that ability to relax and so forth. And I remember, I think in one of the first preseason games I missed a kick, and then I put additional pressure on myself, and really I had the job. All I needed to do was be halfway decent, you know, and I wasn't, you know. And I ended up, you know, being released by the Buffalo Bills at the end of training camp. And I remember sitting in Chuck Knox's office and him talking to me, and little did I realize, because actually several months before that, back in the spring during that NFL draft time there, I actually thought I was going to be drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I only found out afterwards that in fact the Steelers were going to draft me, and the Bills knew that and beat them to it. Because of why I felt so strongly about that was Chuck Noll had actually flown up shortly before the draft on Mr. Rooney's private jet to Syracuse, and the head coach at Syracuse had called me up and said, hey, Chuck Noll is coming to town tomorrow, and just so you know, he's coming here to check out you and only you, not any of us. So I was like, whoa. And he actually was my holder one afternoon out there at Syracuse, which was quite a thrill. And I had, as I recall, I had kicked quite well that day, and that's why I thought I was going to get drafted by the Steelers. And anyway, unbeknownst to me, the moment I was released by the Bills, I was assigned by the Steelers, and that's I ended up in Pittsburgh the next day and spent 13 years. I remember walking in the Steeler locker room. That was a special day too in my life. My locker was right in between Terry Bradshaw's and Franco Harris's, and then the punter, whose name was Craig Colquitt, he came over and was chatting with me, and he mentioned to me, I asked him, you know, this was like on the Thursday before the first game of the season, and I said, so who are we playing on Sunday? And he said, oh no, we're not playing on Sunday, we're playing the Dallas Cowboys on Monday Night Football. Because at the time they were the two best teams in football, and you know, they still really do it to this day. They try to have that opening Monday night game as the team that just won the Super Bowl against one of the other top teams. And so I remember going down to Dallas a few days later, and nervous young rookie, and my first field goal ever in the NFL was blocked by Too Tall Jones, you know, and immediately I got that message real loud and clear: I'm going to have to kick higher, these guys are tall, you know. And I was fortunate in that. I think that's really where my career got started. I kicked, I think, 4 field goals that night, and we won a very exciting game against the Cowboys, something like 35-33, and I kicked several of them late in the game in the fourth quarter, and that's really what most rookies need, is just to have a little success where they can take a deep breath and relax, and that's what I was able to do, and ended up staying in Pittsburgh for a few years. Very much so, because, you know, you can imagine as a young rookie, you've just now, you're terribly excited to be playing in the NFL. You've just made your first NFL team, and I think, you know, we started having these union meetings, and the players, I remember Franco Harris was the Steelers player rep at the time, and we're in these, having these meetings where they're talking about things like pension plans and this and that, you know, and I'm like, I don't want to hear about that stuff, I just want to play, you know. So I think we played maybe, if I recall, 8 or 9 games that year, and then all the NFL players went on strike. And the thing I remember really vividly about that, which is really a great Steeler moment for me, I went down to the players were all outside Three Rivers Stadium, and I went inside, I think, just to grab my cleats. I had no idea how long this strike thing was going to last. And I remember running in the locker room, running into old Mr. Rooney. And he put his arm around me in the locker room. And you must keep in mind now, I'd only been in town, you know, a very short period of time. I mean, I was really the new kid on the block. And he put his arm around me and said, "Son," he said, "I just want you to know that even though this whole strike thing is supposed to be the owners against the players, I know you're new in town. If you need anything during this strike period, I don't know how long it's going to last. Nobody knows that. But just make sure you call me." And he gave me his phone number. He said, "And I'll do whatever it takes to handle whatever concern you have." And I knew then that I was on the right football team.
The owner, Art Rooney, who waited so many years, decades, to finally get a championship, and suddenly they're coming in bouquets for Mr. Rooney, one of the most liked men in all of sport. And he's about to receive the Vince Lombardi Trophy on behalf of his Pittsburgh Steelers. He is a patriarch in every sense of the word. He's the father of this franchise.
You know, I could talk for a long time about the Rooneys, and you know, the thing that for Steeler fans that I think is probably the most significant thing that they need to understand, and I'm probably a good person to be able to assess this, because after I finished playing 13 years at the Steelers, I ended up playing for 4 other teams, and enjoyed my experiences every place I was at. And for the most part, I was very fortunate where I was on what would be considered very good football teams historically. And it's that whole subject of how the Rooneys, the stability that they bring to the Steeler organization, which is really the key to the 6 Super Bowls that the Steelers have won. You know, when you see other franchises that haven't had anywhere near the success, it always is the opposite of what the Rooneys bring to their whole approach to football with their team, the Pittsburgh Steelers. You know, other teams make rash decisions, they're short-term decisions. The Steelers have always had that Rooney approach. It's very methodical, very unemotional. And the Rooneys bring that incredible stability to the Steeler organization, and what that translates to is you have coaches who on average are there for much longer. I don't need to explain that to any Steeler fan. The Steelers haven't had too many head coaches, and along with if you have a stable front office, the Rooney family, the front office, the head coach, you have a stable coaching staff for the most part, and that's going to win for you in the long run, you know. I remember that very vividly, and especially at the time what was, I think, quite special for all the players, you know. there had been that great rivalry between the Steelers and the Oilers, and I think it was Bum Phillips who had come out with that statement, the road to the Super Bowl goes through Pittsburgh. But then what had happened, Jerry Glanville had been the Houston Oilers head coach for a number of years, and if you recall, they had quite a fierce rivalry had developed between Chuck Noll and Jerry Glanville. And as players, we sensed that, and that just kind of multiplied everything by several fold. Coach Noll, who I think I played 13 years for the Steelers, and if I recall correctly, I played about the first 10 under Coach Noll and just a few years with Coach Cowher. And Coach Noll was a very, very intellectual person, probably one of the brightest NFL coaches of all times. He would be in the category of a Bill Walsh, those kind of guys who understood the game at a level that very few other people have ever understood the game. He was kind of what I would call my kind of coach. And what I mean by that, I had very few one-to-one conversations with Chuck Noll, and what amazed me years later, I found out neither did any of those famous players that had played for him. I remember talking to some of them, and they're like, oh, don't worry, I haven't chatted with Chuck more than a couple sentences in 10 years. So he was the kind of coach who, as a young kicker, he used to stay out every afternoon when we finished practice, and I'd do my kicking out there with Mike Webster and the holder holding, and he would be right there, watching every little bit of what I was doing. And he was a man of very few words, and you just kind of sensed as a player that you must be doing a good job if he's not talking to you. At least that's the conclusion I came to, and I know I always had the briefest meeting at the end of the season, the day after the season. The players would have an individual meeting with Chuck Noll, and I'd walk in and out of there in a matter of seconds, and there's a long line of players in the corridor waiting to have their meeting, and they're like, what's up? What happened there? And he used to tell me, I'll see you in July. I was like, that's a good thing. Coach Cowher was a very different personality than Coach Noll. Much more outgoing and, much more, I think, what you'd almost call him more of a modern day coach, and the game's changed, the players have changed, and, Coach Cowher obviously was a much more verbal coach, doing a lot more of the, yelling and screaming, that kind of thing that I never ever heard. Chuck Noll never gave those big rah-rah motivational speeches that fans think we get in the locker room at halftime ever. I never heard. And I remember even talking to some of those great Steeler players and asked, like Terry Bradshaw one day, so how was he like, at halftime or the pregame speech at the early Super Bowls? And they said, oh, he just said, let's go out there and play. Something to very nonchalant and low-key and so forth. So a guy like Jack Lambert had developed his persona, the whole missing teeth, meanest guy who's ever walked the face of the earth, that kind of thing, and growls at everybody like that. And I have to tell you, I remember when I first showed up in Pittsburgh and all the guys, I felt tremendously welcome in the locker room. As a young guy, I was like, well, and the only guy who hadn't said a word to me was Jack Lambert, and I think it was not until my second game playing for the Steelers, we were playing at home in Three Rivers Stadium against the Bengals, and I kicked a couple of field goals late in that game, and we went to overtime and won in overtime. And I was walking through the training room after showering and getting dressed, and Jack Lambert was, toward the end of his career, and I remember he had a couple big bags of ice on his knees, and he's sitting on one of those training room benches, and he growled at me as I walked by. I was about 10 years old. He said, "Hey, rookie," and he kind of beckoned me over to him. I didn't know if he was going to crack me or what. And he put his hand out and shook my hand and said, "Good kicking." That's when I knew I was welcome in Pittsburgh. It was really neat last year to come back to Pittsburgh. They had that 75th anniversary team, and I was fortunate to be selected for that. And I hadn't seen Greg in years, but another guy. I've been around a lot of players like that. They're It's the image that they portray on the field, and it's the way they play the game, you know. And you know, we all know to be a linebacker in the NFL, you got to be mean, you know, and nasty like Greg Lloyd, and he was on the field. But you know, in real life, you often find that who they really are and their persona for television and for fans are two completely different scenarios. Show up as this guy who was a potential Olympic sprinter from Purdue University, to watch him go from being a guy that could run just about faster than anybody in the entire country or world, to learn through a lot of hard work to learn his craft to the level that he took it to, which is maybe greater than any cornerback who's ever played the game. So, you know, that was one of the really exciting things for me early in my career, just to be around a lot of great football players and just to observe how hard they worked. You know, it wasn't like they were born, you know, to be these great Steeler football players. I mean, these guys worked harder at their craft than any people I've ever seen in any occupation in my life.
Myron Cope.
Hardball, you can't possibly make nothing out of this. You can't make nothing. I'm going to make you into buttermilk.
Let's face it, my voice is not what you think of as a broadcasting voice.
Hit him. His teeth are in the third row.
In 1975, Cope's passion for the Steelers led him to invent the team's most visible symbol, the terrible towel.
Early in my career, I know Myron nicknamed me Automatic Anderson, and you know, just, I mean, obviously a Steeler legend, and it was very sad to see him pass away recently. My goal was to be like these other guys who I had played with, and that was to play my whole career for the Steelers. And you know, many years later, being able to reflect back on it, we all get a lot more wisdom as we get older. And you know, I think I could make the argument that sometimes change is good in life. You know, I mean, I remember going all of a sudden to the Philadelphia Eagles. I'm at training camp where Latrobe was such a comfortable place for me, and now I'm at the Eagles training camp and I felt like a rookie again, you know. So, and you know, toward the end of my career, it was especially satisfying. You know, I had guys on our team were half my age, you know, and they used to think I was some kind of gray-haired grandfather or something. I remember one day working out in Minnesota. I was down at the Vikings facilities running on the treadmill in the off-season. Must have been shortly after the draft, and there were a couple of young players, and I didn't even know who they were. And you know, maybe this young guy was some player that the Vikings had signed as a free agent, and he came over, and I was running on the treadmill, and he addressed me as sir. and then he sort of had this puzzled look on his face, and he called me Mr. after that. He said, "Mr. Anderson," he said, "how many years have you played?" He said, "I was watching you when I was a little kid, you know." And I told him, I don't know what it was, 20 years at the time, and he said, "I wasn't even born when you were playing." So I knew about then it was time to retire.
He had this magnificent season.
At 15-1, the Vikings weren't perfect, but kicker Gary Anderson was. He didn't miss a kick the entire regular season.
Anderson is connected on 46 consecutive field goals.
History of the National Football League, Gary Anderson had the first ever perfect season.
No, nobody had ever done it before. And, you know, as field goal kickers, you know, like any athletes, you go through streaks at different times. If you, at least the media calls it streaks, where things go well and, you know, maybe, I don't know what I had done in Pittsburgh, but make X number of kicks in a row and break somebody's record. But actually go an entire season without missing a kick. I mean, years later, being able to reflect back on that, that really was an incredible achievement, but not just from my part, because when you think of what goes into just kicking one extra point or field goal, with all those guys blocking and the snap and the hold, and then you throw in all the crazy weather conditions that we have to play these games in. And I think on top of that, that year in '98, the Vikings scored the most number of points in the history of the NFL at the time. So we were scoring a lot, and I was kicking a lot of field goals that year. I think it was something like 35. So to do all of those and whatever it was, 60-something extra points, without one bad snap or hold or, you know, something, some guy blowing an assignment and letting some guy come in there and block one, or me shanking one or something. I mean, I would never have believed that that could have been possible to go a whole season without missing a kick.
It wasn't a 55-yard kick. It wasn't outside. It wasn't cold. And for him to miss, what a tough way for him to be known in this town.
Gary Anderson has missed a field goal for the first time in 2 years. Gary Anderson doesn't miss, and yet he misses this field goal.
But do they still recall that at all?
Oh, I'm sure some people do, you know. And that's really, I mean, the life of a field goal kicker, you know. It took me many years before I had to experience that. But, you know, what we do for a job, you know, I've never had anybody after a game come up to me and say, hey, you played okay today. It's either, you know, you were the hero because you won the game, or stuff. What were you thinking about out there? You know, you missed that stupid kick there in the second quarter and we lost by 2 points, you know. So I had been very fortunate throughout my entire career until that '98 season. And I had always, you know, was one of the things that I took exceptional pride in, is always being the guy that the rest of my teammates and coaches could count on to get the job done. And that particular game, unfortunately, I missed a kick, and but you know, as a field goal kicker, you understand that's part of the deal. You know, I learned very early on that, hey, you're not going to make all your kicks, and you know, just try to make most of them when it counts. And of course, I mean, looking back on that, obviously it was extremely disappointing, and you can certainly make the argument that, you know, had I made that kick, it would be quite likely that we would have gone to the Super Bowl. And, you know, I always, you know, had a different perspective. I never ever got too high on myself when I did kick the game-winning field goal. I'm kind of like, as a field goal kicker, you're kind of like the hitman out there. You know, nobody knows the offensive lineman how well they really played, unless it was glaringly obvious, you know. But as a field goal kicker, that's part of the deal. You're the guy who's got to go out there and have that last second shot. Promise you, when I'm out there doing what I'm passionate about in retirement, which is fly fishing, and I'm focused on catching my next trout, that I'm not thinking about things like that, you know. But certainly, I mean, if that opportunity arose, I believe you have to be out of the game for 5 years, and one of these days it'll be 5 years for me, and that would be a fantastic honor to be selected into the NFL Hall of Fame.